welcome to our deep dive, into this intricate world of the
Yeah.
European Union, ASEAN, and India. At first glance, you might
Yeah.
think, what on earth could these three possibly have in common? But in today's world,
Right.
everything is kind of interconnected. We've got a real mixed bag of sources,
Yes.
articles, reports, historical summaries. So get ready to uncover some
Absolutely.
unexpected connections and maybe even challenge some assumptions.
Yeah. I think what I find particularly interesting about, the subject we're going to be talking about today is that, these relationships are a product of not just modern economic interests,
Right.
but also deep historical currents that continue to shape their interactions today. So,
Yeah, and I'm always a sucker for a good origin story, and luckily we have one here. The EU, for example, has a fascinating emblem, 12 gold stars on a blue background.
hmm
But it's more than just a pretty design, right?
oh yeah, it's deeply symbolic actually. Those 12 stars represent the ideals of unity, solidarity, and harmony among the people of Europe.
Oh, wow.
The goal was to create a shared European identity that could transcend, national divisions and historical conflicts.
Wow. Yeah, and it's not just symbolism. The EU started with just 6 countries,
Mm-hmm.
and it's expanded to 28, even with the recent exit of the UK.
Right.
That's a pretty big family to manage.
Yes.
It makes me wonder how the euro, their shared currency, impacts their economic power compared to, say, the US dollar.
The euro is a fascinating case study. It is the second most traded currency globally, giving the eurozone significant economic clout. However, as we saw with Brexit, maintaining unity within such a diverse group
Yep.
is a constant challenge. Each member brings its own economic strengths and weaknesses, political systems, cultural nuances. So,
It's a delicate balancing act, trying to harmonize all of those differing interests and still present a united front to the world.
yeah.
And speaking of diverse groups, let's shift our focus across the continent to ASEAN, 10 Southeast Asian nations working together for economic growth,
Yes.
but they seem to have a very different approach than the EU.
Absolutely. ASEAN operates on the principle of the ASEAN Way, which prioritizes consensus building and non-interference in each other's domestic affairs.
Okay?
It's a stark contrast to the EU's more integrated structure with its shared sovereignty and common policies.
It's amazing how they managed to find common ground, despite, the vast differences in their political systems and economies. You have communist Vietnam, the monarchy in Thailand,
Right.
and everything in between. So how do they even begin to reconcile those differences?
Well, that's the key to the ASEAN Way. It recognizes that diversity is a strength,
Right.
not a weakness. It allows members to collaborate on shared goals while respecting each other's unique circumstances. It's a fascinating model of regional cooperation.
All right, so we've got the EU and ASEAN. Now, where does India fit into this global puzzle? We know it's a rising economic power with growing global influence,
Yeah.
but what are its connections to these two regions?
Well, India's role is becoming increasingly crucial. It's actively forging strategic partnerships with both the EU and ASEAN with a strong focus on trade technology and security cooperation.
hmm
India sees these relationships as vital stepping stones to achieving its ambition of becoming a major player on the world stage.
What I find particularly interesting is India's historical connection to both regions.
Yeah,
Its history is intertwined with Europe through colonialism, but it also shares deep cultural and historical ties with Southeast Asia.
right.
How do you think this shared past shapes India's approach to these relationships today?
It's definitely a complex factor. The legacy of colonialism undoubtedly shapes perceptions and adds layers of complexity to these relationships.
Right.
India's experience with European colonial rule and its historical and cultural ties with Southeast Asia create a unique dynamic. And it's important to remember that the past isn't truly past, it continues to influence the present.
So we have these three major players, each with its own history, its own motivations, its own goals.
hmm
But what are the common threads that bind them together in today's world?
Despite their differences, the EU, ASEAN, and India are increasingly united by a shared set of interests.
Okay.
They all recognize the urgent need to tackle global challenges like climate change,
Yes.
ensure maritime security, and promote sustainable development. These are issues that transcend borders and demand collective action.
It sounds like a classic case of, we're all in this together, even if they don't always see eye to eye on the specifics.
Yeah.
And speaking of interconnectedness, I know that ASEAN and India have a free trade agreement,
Right.
and the EU is negotiating a similar deal with India. So these trade agreements suggest a pretty deep level of economic interdependence.
Absolutely. Economic ties are a major driver of these relationships. Free trade agreements boost economic growth for everyone involved, and it fosters interdependence, and it creates a powerful incentive for cooperation on other issues as well.
Okay, but let's get real for a moment. It's not all sunshine and roses in the world of international relations.
Yeah.
These are powerful players with competing interests, and I imagine there are also points of tension and disagreement.
Oh, you're absolutely right. Geopolitical tensions, trade disputes, and differing approaches to democracy and human rights are all significant challenges that these regions have to navigate. Their relationships aren't static. They're constantly evolving in response to global events and shifting power dynamics.
It's like a giant complex dance, trying to find the right steps to move forward together,
Yeah,
while also looking out for their own interests. What I find particularly fascinating is how a conflict on one side of the world can have such a ripple effect across the globe, highlighting the interconnectedness of our world.
exactly. It underscores the need for diplomacy, multilateralism, and a commitment to finding peaceful solutions to complex global challenges. And that's just one example. Think about the ongoing conflict in Ukraine and its global ripples. How do you think it impacts these regions' relationships with each other and with Russia?
That's a question I'm eager to unpack.
Yeah,
The war in Ukraine has definitely reshaped the global landscape,
it has.
and I'm sure it's having a significant impact on these relationships as well.
It has indeed. The war in Ukraine has exposed fault lines in the international order and forced countries to reevaluate their alliances and priorities.
Mm-hmm.
It's put a strain on the EU's relationship with Russia and raised questions about energy security and economic interdependence.
And how does this impact India's relationship with these regions?
Well, India has taken a more nuanced stance on the conflict.
Okay.
Emphasizing diplomacy and dialogue, this has led to some friction with the West, particularly over India's continued purchase of Russian oil. However, India's strategic autonomy and its desire to maintain good relations with all sides make it a crucial player in this evolving geopolitical landscape.
So it's a lot more complex than just picking sides.
Right.
Each player has to carefully consider its own interests, its history, and its long-term goals when navigating this new global reality.
Precisely. And that's what makes these relationships so fascinating to study. They're constantly in motion, shaped by a complex interplay of factors.
We've covered a lot of ground already, from post-war recovery and the rise of regional blocs to the challenges of navigating a multipolar world. I feel like we've just scratched the surface of these interconnected relationships.
Indeed. And in the next part of our deep dive, we'll delve into specific examples of how these relationships play out in the real world, looking at areas like trade sustainability and security.
So if you're ready to go even deeper, join us for the next part of this fascinating exploration. Welcome back to our deep dive. We've set the stage, we've introduced the key players,
Yeah.
but now I really want to get into the real world implications of
Yeah.
these relationships. So let's start with trade.
Yes.
It's a powerful force that really shapes interactions on a global scale.
Trade is absolutely fundamental to understanding how the EU, ASEAN, and India connect, and it's not just about exchanging goods and services.
Right.
It's about building interdependence and shaping the global economic landscape.
You mentioned earlier that ASEAN and India have a free trade agreement.
Yes.
I'll admit I don't fully grasp the nuts and bolts of how such agreements actually work in practice.
Sure.
Could you shed some light on that for me and our listeners?
Of course. So the ASEAN-India Free Trade Agreement, or AFTA as it's often called,
Yep.
came into effect in 2010, and essentially it's designed to create a more favorable environment for trade between the 10 ASEAN countries and India.
Okay.
And it does that by reducing tariffs and streamlining customs procedures.
So instead of facing a bunch of roadblocks and extra costs,
Exactly.
goods and services can just flow more easily between these nations.
Precisely, and this has led to a significant increase in bilateral trade volume. India's exports to ASEAN, for example, have grown substantially since AFTA's implementation.
Wow.
We're talking about sectors like refined petroleum, precious stones, vehicles,
Wow.
a whole range of products.
Okay, that's a pretty compelling example of how these agreements can translate into real economic benefits.
Yeah.
What about the EU's attempts to secure a trade deal with India?
Right.
Those negotiations have been going on for a while, haven't they?
They have, and it's proven to be a complex process. Both sides are trying to find a balance,
Right.
maximizing their economic gains while protecting sensitive industries and addressing concerns from various stakeholders.
I imagine those negotiations involve a lot of give and take.
Absolutely.
What are some of the key sticking points that have made it difficult to reach a final agreement?
Well, one major issue is market access.
Okay,
The EU wants greater access for its goods and services in the Indian market,
makes sense.
particularly in areas like automobiles and dairy products. India, on the other hand,
Yeah,
is seeking greater access for its service sector professional,
okay.
particularly in IT and healthcare.
So it's about finding that sweet spot where both sides feel like they're getting a fair deal,
Exactly.
but it's not just about economic gains, right?
Right.
There are also social and political implications to consider.
Absolutely. Trade agreements can have a ripple effect on domestic industries and labor markets. Some sectors might benefit while others face challenges.
Sure.
That's why it's crucial to have policies in place to support workers and communities
Yeah.
that might be adversely affected.
It's about ensuring that the benefits of free trade are distributed fairly
Yes,
and don't come at the expense of vulnerable groups.
exactly.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and talk about sustainability. It's an issue that's become, increasingly important in international relations these days.
Absolutely.
And I'm curious how it plays into these relationships.
Well, climate change is a global challenge that transcends borders. And all three entities, the EU, ASEAN, and India, recognize the urgent need for collective action.
The EU is often seen as a leader in environmental policy. What role do they play in supporting sustainability efforts in ASEAN and India?
The EU has been actively engaging with both ASEAN and India on several fronts. They're sharing expertise, providing financial assistance for climate change mitigation and adaptation projects,
Mm-hmm.
and promoting renewable energy development.
I recently read about an EU-funded initiative
Oh, right.
to help coastal communities in Southeast Asia adapt to rising sea levels.
Yes,
That's a very real threat for the region.
absolutely.
And it's great to see, tangible efforts to address it.
Yeah, it's a prime example of how collaboration can make a difference. The EU is also working closely with India on clean energy partnerships,
Oh, wow.
supporting the growth of solar and wind power.
Mm-hmm.
These collaborations are all about transitioning to a more sustainable energy future and reducing carbon emissions.
Okay, it's encouraging to see these partnerships in action,
Yeah,
proving that, global challenges can be tackled through cooperation and shared knowledge.
right.
Now let's move on to another critical area, security.
Yeah.
How do these regions work together to address shared security concerns in such a volatile world?
Well, security cooperation is a vital aspect of these relationships. All three entities face a complex web of security threats,
Right.
from terrorism and transnational crime to maritime piracy and cybersecurity challenges.
And it's not just talk, they're actually taking concrete steps to address these threats collectively, right?
Absolutely. The EU, for instance, has been participating in joint naval exercises with ASEAN countries
Oh, wow.
to combat piracy in the Strait of Malacca,
Mm-hmm.
a crucial shipping lane for global trade.
Yeah, that's a powerful example of how they're pooling resources and expertise to protect shared interests.
Exactly.
What about India's role in regional security?
Well, India plays a key role in regional security forums like the ASEAN Regional Forum,
Mm-hmm.
where they engage in dialogue and cooperation on security issues.
Mm-hmm.
They're also actively increasing their naval presence in the Indian Ocean region, working to ensure maritime security and freedom of navigation.
So it's a multifaceted approach,
Yeah,
combining dialogue, cooperation, and a willingness to project power when necessary.
exactly.
It's striking how these relationships are so multi-layered, encompassing cooperation, competition, and even occasional friction. It's not a simple equation of, friendship or rivalry, is it?
You've hit a nail on the head. International relations are rarely black and white. There are
Yeah.
always multiple interests at play.
Yeah.
And these relationships are constantly evolving in response to global events and domestic pressures. It's a complex dance of shared interests and strategic calculations.
Speaking of complexity, I'm curious about how the ongoing conflict in Ukraine has impacted these relationships.
Yeah,
It's such a defining event in recent history. It's bound to have some ripple effects.
you're right. The war in Ukraine has been a major disruptor,
Yeah.
forcing countries worldwide to reevaluate their alliances and priorities.
Yeah.
The EU, for instance, has taken a strong stance against Russia's actions,
Right.
imposing sanctions and providing support to Ukraine.
Has that caused any friction with ASEAN or India given their own relationships with Russia?
It has, particularly with India,
Okay.
which has maintained a more neutral stance, emphasizing diplomacy and dialogue rather than outright condemnation of Russia. This difference in approach has led to some tension,
Okay.
especially as the EU seeks to present a united front against Russia's aggression.
So even when faced with a shared global challenge,
Yes.
there are different perspectives and approaches which can sometimes lead to friction. It's like trying to navigate a multi-lane highway with everyone heading in slightly different directions.
That's a great analogy. It highlights the challenges of global governance in a multipolar world where power is more diffuse
Hmm.
and countries have more diverse interests and priorities.
We've covered a lot of ground in this section,
We have.
from the mechanics of free trade agreements to the complexities of security cooperation in a rapidly changing world.
Yeah,
It's clear that these relationships are more than just diplomatic handshakes.
right.
They have real-world consequences.
Indeed. And in the final part of our deep dive, we'll step back and examine the broader implications of these evolving relationships for the future of global governance and the international order.
So stay tuned for our final analysis, where we'll connect the dots and explore what the future might hold for this dynamic trio. Welcome back to the final part of our deep dive. We've explored the history, the economic ties, the shared concerns, and even some of the friction points between the EU, ASEAN, and India. Now, I want to kind of take a step back and look at the bigger picture. What does the future hold for these relationships, and how might they shape the world we live in?
That's the million-dollar question. These relationships are dynamic and constantly evolving, but they have the potential to reshape the global landscape in profound ways.
One thing that you've mentioned a few times is this idea of a multipolar world. I have a general sense of what that means, but could you break it down a bit further for me?
Sure.
How would a multipolar world differ from the current global order, and what role do you see the EU, ASEAN, and India playing in this shift?
Okay, so think of it this way. For decades, we've lived in a world dominated by a single superpower,
Right.
the United States. But as other nations rise in economic and political power, we're seeing a shift towards a more multipolar system. Imagine a table with multiple power centers instead of just one.
Okay.
In this scenario, the EU, ASEAN, and India, along with other rising powers like China,
Yeah.
would have a much greater say in shaping global norms and institutions.
So it's not just about military might or economic dominance anymore.
Exactly. It becomes more about influence, strategic partnerships, and the ability to build consensus on global issues. It's a much more complex and fluid system with no single actor calling all the shots.
Okay, that raises a fascinating question then. What kind of world order are we moving towards? Will this multipolar system be based on cooperation and shared values? Or are we headed for a future of increased competition and conflict between these emerging power centers?
It's likely to be a mix of both.
Right.
And that's what makes it so fascinating and unpredictable. On the one hand, these regions have a clear shared interest in tackling transnational challenges like climate change,
Yeah.
pandemics, cyber threats. These issues require global cooperation and a willingness to compromise.
But on the other hand, there's bound to be competition for resources, influence, and technological dominance.
You're absolutely right. We're already seeing this play out from areas like trade technology and even security.
Hmm.
Each of these players has its own ambitions and strategic goals, and those goals won't always align perfectly.
So it's not a simple case of, good guys and bad guys.
No.
It's a complex web of relationships where countries have to balance their own interests with the need for global cooperation.
Precisely, it's about finding ways to cooperate on issues of common interest while also navigating those areas where interests diverge. It requires a delicate balancing act and a willingness to engage in diplomacy and compromise.
Given these complexities, how do you see the EU, ASEAN, and India positioning themselves in this emerging multipolar world? Do their different approaches to regional integration and global governance give us any clues about how they might act on the world stage?
Okay, so let's start with the EU with its emphasis on multilateralism, a rules-based international order, and its experience in navigating complex internal dynamics. The EU could play a crucial role in shaping global norms and institutions in this new era.
But as we've discussed, the EU isn't always a united front. Brexit showed us that internal divisions can impact its ability to act decisively on the world stage.
That's true, but the EU remains a major economic and political force, and its commitment to multilateralism gives it a unique voice in global affairs. Now let's consider ASEAN. They seem to have a more cautious approach, emphasizing consensus building and non-interference.
Right.
How might that translate into their role in a multipolar world?
It's a good question. Their approach has certainly helped maintain stability within the region, but does it limit their ability to project power or influence beyond Southeast Asia?
It's possible ASEAN's strength lies in its ability to foster dialogue and cooperation within a diverse group of nations. However, as their economic and political clout grows, they might become more assertive in global forums, advocating for their interests and shaping regional dynamics.
And then we have India, a rising power with its own ambitions and a complex relationship with both the EU and ASEAN. How do you see India navigating this multipolar landscape?
India is a wild card. In many ways, it's fiercely protective of its strategic autonomy,
Okay.
meaning it's hesitant to align too closely with any single power or bloc. It wants to maintain good relations with all sides, which gives it a unique degree of flexibility.
So it's less about joining a particular team and more about pursuing its own interests and forging strategic partnerships where they make sense.
Exactly. India's growing economic power, its military capabilities, and its strategic location in the Indo-Pacific region give it significant leverage in this multipolar world. It will be fascinating to see how India chooses to use that leverage in the coming years.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I'm struck by how much we've uncovered. We've gone from exploring the historical roots of these relationships to contemplating the future of global governance. It's clear that the EU, ASEAN, and India are at the heart of a profound transformation in the international system.
It's an exciting and challenging time to be studying these dynamics. There are so many factors at play: economic interdependence, technological advancements, shifting power dynamics, and the enduring impact of history and culture.
It feels like we've only scratched the surface.
Yeah.
There's so much more to learn, so many questions left to explore.
And that's the beauty of it. These relationships are dynamic and constantly evolving. The key is to stay curious, keep questioning, and be open to new perspectives.
That's a great note to end on. I want to thank you for guiding us through this fascinating deep dive. I have a feeling our listeners will come away with a much richer understanding of how interconnected our world truly is and the forces that are shaping its future.
It's been my pleasure. I hope this deep dive has sparked some new ideas and encouraged everyone to continue exploring the complex and ever-changing world of international